Before we get started, everyone, thank you for being here this evening. A quick housekeeping details to cover. We will be recording the session this evening so that our friends who couldn't be here can watch the recording later on. And then in order to cut down on any background noise, distractions, interruptions, we do ask that everyone who's not speaking, our speakers, Dr. Weiss and Professor Levine, if everyone can keep their microphones on mute. And if you are not familiar with Zoom, there's a little microphone icon in the bottom left corner, I believe. So feel free to click that to mute yourself. We will have the opportunity for all of our guests to ask questions this evening. So feel free to type your question into the chat box, and we'll make sure that we monitor those and respond to them during our Q&A portion. So without further ado, let me start recording and we'll get started. Oh, I don't have the permission to record, so we'll use the recording from the main screen. Okay, so officially, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Amanda Colburn, and I serve as the Program Manager and Academic Advisor for the Education Policy Program at Drexel University. Welcome to this evening's conversation with Dr. Elaine Weiss, where we will be discussing some topics from her new book, Broader, Bolder, Better: How Schools and Communities Help Students Overcome the Disadvantages of Poverty. So to give you an idea of the agenda for this evening, we'll start out with some brief introductions. We will head right into our conversation with Professor Levine and Dr. Weiss, and then we will open up to questions and answers. And we'll conclude our session this evening with a brief overview of the Education Policy Program at Drexel. So to get started, tonight's session is proudly presented by the Education Policy Program at Drexel University's School of Education. And at Drexel, we like to focus on more than just the textbooks, more than just the theory and the classroom learning. We aim to expose our students to the field of education policy through encounters with practitioners, such as Dr. Weiss, and experiences that bring your education to life and connect it to practice. So Drexel offers an online post-baccalaureate certificate program in education policy, as well as a concentration in a number of other master's and doctoral programs at the school. So we'll discuss the academic program at Drexel in more depth at the end of our session this evening, so be sure to stick around after our conversation to learn more. So at this time, I will turn everything over to our Education Policy Program Director, Bruce Levine.
Thanks, Amanda. I am Bruce Levine, and I am currently also the director of the Washington, D.C. Center, besides being a faculty member in the School of Ed and the director of the program. Tonight, we are very happy to have with us a good friend and colleague, Dr. Elaine Weiss. I'm just going to say a few select things about Elaine. Could go on for hours, but we'll stop. We'll just keep it at a few minutes. Elaine is the lead policy analyst for income security at the National Academy of Social Insurance, where she spearheads projects on Social Security, unemployment insurance, and workers' comp. Prior to her work at the Academy, she was the national coordinator for the Broader, Bolder Approach to Education, which was a campaign launched by the Economic Policy Institute. There, she did a number of things, including case studies of diverse communities across the country that employ comprehensive whole child approaches to education. She's authored a series of papers just last year with EPI economist Emma Garcia on the drivers of teacher shortages. She's written a number of other papers in earlier years. She's authored dozens of blogs for the Huffington Post, Washington Post Answer Sheet, and other entities. And she's been interviewed for numerous radio shows on NPR and otherwise. Before going to BBA, she was with the Pew Charitable Trust, where she served as project manager for Pew's Partnership for America's Economic Success campaign. Educationally, she's got a PhD in public policy from the George Washington University, a JD from Harvard Law School, and a BA and a BS from University of Maryland, College Park. So many good credentials. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
The book, which I will hold up, is a great book. I mean, and I say that not simply because we're friends. It's really a very timely book, and it came out last year. And before we get into discussing it, I thought I would just frame the conversation a bit in terms of the situation at the time that this book is arriving for everybody to be reading. So, and to start, I'm actually going to quote from your book, which this is page 220. And it is this: growing economic inequality and shifting demographic trends, including the fact that our public schools are educating more low-income children, more children of color, and more non-English speaking and immigrant children than ever before, create an imperative for national, state, and local leaders do a better job of preparing our young people for success, or the nation's future is imperiled. This imperative impels us to find and implement more effective strategies for educating all our children to high levels. So essentially, to me, what that's saying is the level of poverty among our children in this country is at incredibly high levels. Our schools are being faced with ever-increasing demands for educating these students, and we're putting a lot of demands on our students here in the 21st century to be successful citizens and human beings. And from a political and policy standpoint, we have a situation where in 2016, ESSA was enacted, which seemed to open up doors for the states to take on and undertake various new and creative ways to address some of these problems. In 2018, we saw the election of a number of new state-level officials, be they governors or legislators, who seem to have an appetite for taking on these problems. The federal government, not much has been happening. I'll just say that to be charitable over the last few years. But now, as this election comes up, we see candidates on the Democratic side, some of whom have very robust platforms for how they would deal with these issues. So there's a lot going on. And so this book really, in my view, offers a roadmap for addressing some of these impediments caused by poverty. And so what I thought we would jump in would be to talk about the proposition that you and your co-author, Paul Reville, seem to make, which is the importance of having community level conversations as the basis for moving the efforts to attack the poverty implications in some important way. And so I would love to hear more about what's going on with those conversations. How do they get started? But in the course of doing that, one of the things that I've become aware of in my own work is that the nomenclature around these issues is far from clear. And so for people who are joining us for the first time and not really knowing much about this, or even if you have, I think hearing you sort of weave in a little explanation about that would be great.
I think it is a great place to start, and it is something that my co-author, Paul Reville, who is phenomenal, and I think is probably responsible for much of the language that you quoted there, which is excellent. He and I had several conversations about this, and one of the challenges we talked about, obviously the challenges in the book are large and numerous. One of the basic challenges is that we really don't have a terminology, a kind of terms of art to use here. And we struggled with that. What do we call the book? What do we call what these communities are doing? They call them different things. And there's community schools featured multiple places in the book. There's an initiative called Bright Futures USA. A lot of part of what these communities do is wrap support, so-called, around children and around families. One of the terms that has come up recently, so all of those are important. None of them does quite captured, and they also don't cut across the communities. And part of what we really felt was important to convey is these communities are addressing these needs differently, and they should be doing so because communities are different. They have different assets, different needs, different demographics, different sizes, and these varying approaches are appropriate. And we really emphasize over and over in the book the importance of marrying that local approach with state support and the right federal investments, and that's the recipe. So getting back to your question, one of the terms that has come around recently is integrated student supports, which kind of is in a neutral zone. It's not attached to anyone. It's not a brand. It has had some very good research attached to it, including maybe most prominently by an organization called Child Trends that we really respect and cite in the book. But even that we felt didn't fully address this because integrating support speaks a lot to that wraparound. And part of what we wanted to talk about was there's not enough focus on not only the lack of opportunity that kids growing up in disadvantaged circumstances experience, which wraparound and integrated student supports address, but the importance of enrichment. And that is the other piece. There is a lack of enrichment for kids, and enrichment is critical. And so the way we frame this book is all of these communities are using or integrating student supports in order to advance whole child education. So it's a big mouthful. It doesn't fit well on a bumper sticker. As we talked about, it's a reason that it didn't make it into our title, and sadly, I think makes our Google searches less effective, and I'm probably selling fewer books, but we felt that nailing it and conveying the whole of what we thought was important in these communities was more critical than Google searches.
Yeah.
So we went with it.
That makes sense. Hopefully that clears it up for everybody from now on. So yeah, so back to the other part of the question, which was the community conversations. How do those get started, and what do those look like when they do get started?
So this was something that struck us also. Obviously, in selecting these dozen communities to study, there were criteria. We were looking at, are they all engaged in integrated student supports to advance whole child education, and what are the common things that they did to make that happen? And one of the first things that stood out to us is that they had these difficult conversations about not only student poverty, importantly student poverty, but family poverty and the impacts in the community. And these are difficult conversations to have, but important. And I actually want to kind of narrate or recount one of those, kind of how that went about, to give an example. So CJ Huff, a superintendent in Joplin, featured very prominently in the book, and also a joint friend and colleague now of Bruce's and mine, I think illustrates really well both the importance of these conversations and how to do them. So he came in as superintendent of Joplin, having come from a much smaller school district. Joplin is a medium-sized school district in the southwest corner of Missouri. And it's also a very conservative community, which has an impact on how you have these conversations and how the conversations vary from a community to another. But he came in and he said, immediate look, he was tasked with what superintendents are always tasked with: make our graduation rates better, boost the achievement, get our kids, on the right track. And he said, what I see is these teachers and kids really burdened by these unmet needs associated with poverty, and a community that has no clue what's going on in the schools and is detached from the schools. And until the community is aware of what's going on in the schools and the reality, we aren't going to make much progress, because really a superintendent alone can't do that, can't fix those problems. This requires the community weighing in and taking part and being engaged and having skin in the game. And so CJ started in an unusual way for a superintendent. He spent the first 6 to 9 months using the team that would have normally, put together the plan for raising graduation rates and all that, literally going out to the community, going to parents, going to local businesses, going to agencies, social service agencies, hospitals, and others, and talking and saying, what are your needs? What do you see that's going on? What is your stake in how well our kids do? And how do you perceive the burdens on people? And that's how he started these conversations. And the other thing I want to say that's important that probably we'll come back to in the conversation is he said, I also knew that churches would be critical to this conversation. And I really struggled to get churches in there. And I want to kind of go back to that later. But what is also critical is his framing of this was, all of you have time, talent, and treasure to give to make our schools work and to enable us to achieve our goals for our kids. And I think that's important because it's a very individualistic way of approaching. It's not, we as a community have a responsibility to solve poverty. We're going to give parents more wages, none of those things. You individually can take some responsibility. This is what you can do as a person, which I think is important. It contrasts very starkly to me with how those conversations went down in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, which is an enormous, it's the 17th biggest school district in the country. We have now 206 schools, 165,000 students, and one of the most progressive places in the country. And obviously you're not gonna, send a team of 4 people out to have conversations with all those parents. And that happened very differently. Former superintendent Jerry Weiss, who started about 15 years ago, looked around, saw very similar patterns to what CJ Huff was seeing in Joplin, and said, there are whole zones of the county where kids just don't have the opportunities, they don't have the resources of what they need. And he started tagging those schools as red zone schools and said, then we've got schools where kids have loads of opportunity. We're going to call those green zone schools. And he used that framing to go back to the school board and say, we need to do something differently about this. And the first thing we need to do is really put a lot of resources, shift our resources into those red opportunity zone schools. And that opened the community conversation about the opportunities not open to those kids. So a very different kind of conversation.
Right, and I'm glad you highlighted the 2 different areas, because I think a lot of people assume that, call it community schools, integrated student services, are relevant in urban schools as opposed to rural and suburban schools that just have certain types of issues. And poverty, unfortunately, runs across all of those. Increasingly, I think, in the suburbs, people have sort of assumed suburbs not relevant.
Yes.
That's clearly not true.
Well, I'm really glad you raised that. Because one of the other things that Paul and I discussed in putting the book together was, in all these years that poverty has been discussed, the issue of poverty in schools, although we really came about our work in reaction to 15 years of, yelling that poverty was just an excuse rather than actually the root cause of these problems, which is really what it is, no excuse whatsoever. But whatever those conversations were, they were almost invariably about urban poverty. And urban poverty is a huge problem, and it is often concentrated, but there is massive rural poverty in this country, and that is invisible. And we really, really wanted to shine a spotlight on that in the book. And that was one of the things we were most proud about, was talking about these rural communities and the different and often much more difficult challenges they face than anywhere else. And the fact that indeed, this is spreading like wildfire in suburbia. So there's no more option to sit this out on the sidelines and say, this is their problem, not our problem. It is now pretty much our problem, no matter where we are, which I think has actually helped us get to the point where this book can make a difference, because nobody can sit it out anymore.
Right. Unfortunately true. So going back to the conversation, so CJ and Joplin, so he started those conversations. How have people found it most effective to end up in getting people engaged? I mean, how quickly did the churches or anybody else in Joplin jump on that? Was that a long-term process, or is that something that he just really, struck a chord?
Well, CJ being CJ would probably say that it took him forever,
right.
because he is not the most patient and also accomplishes sort of extraordinary things in short amounts of time, as we both know. I would say that what's happened with Bright Futures is pretty much by any objective measure remarkable. So CJ started in Joplin 8-9 years ago, roughly. Just to give a benchmark, there are now 65 Bright Futures affiliates. So that's one measure of how successful this has been. But to talk about Joplin, one of the challenges he did face in the initial conversations were churches. And he knew churches would be critical to this, because this is, as he called it, the buckle of the Bible Belt. You don't get your churches, you're not going to get people on board. And churches are where the resources are, where the volunteers are, and all of that. Mm-hmm. So he went back and said, I think we need to target churches differently. Churches are just afraid of schools. They are so wary of this whole church, state wall thing, that they've just decided they are better off just not coming in. And he said, so we had a special breakfast just for churches. And I addressed them personally. And I basically said to them, look, you guys all see this all the time in your churches. You are supporting the same families that need support in our schools. We have to be partners in this. And even then, most people were wary, but a couple people, one guy in particular, got up and said, look, he's calling us to do this and telling us basically to minister the way we minister in our churches, but without our minister hats on in schools. This is what we're called on to do. We're going to stand up and do it. And it was remarkable. just kind of that one conversation led to all of a sudden all these lunch buddies that these kids who had no safe adults in their lives needed, that the schools had been totally unable to recruit through YMCAs and Boys and Girls Clubs. They had 120 of them within a couple weeks. They had their lunch buddies. They had whole churches lining up to, pull the snack packs together. It just kind of snowballed from there. And that guy who got that ball rolling is now on their national board. So I would say it was rather remarkable and quick success, but I'm sure that CJ would define it differently.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. So one of the things that's great about the book is you give a number of case studies. It's very rich with that. So talk a little bit more, if you would, about a few other examples. Like I know, Boston, East.
So they really do vary tremendously. I think there's a couple that are particularly interesting. I know you and I were talking, and I was saying, when I went through the book, I was saying I could give a medal to this community for this and a medal to this community for this, because they're extraordinary in different ways. But a couple I'd love to talk about that I think are off the beaten track that folks might not know about. One is a neighborhood called Tangelo Park in Orlando. It was at the time a virtually all African-American, very high poverty community. This is about 20 something years ago at this point, and also had massive crime problems. And it really started with the community, some people getting up and saying, you know what, we are not going to wait for the police to come in and do either good things or bad things in our community. We are going to take charge of this. And the fact that there were these take charge people in that community led a billionaire in that city who had made his fortune. He grew up poor on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, came to Orlando, made a fortune opening hotels, wanted to give back to Orlando, saw this kind of initiative in Tangelo Park and said, this is where this is going to happen. Luckily, it was not your standard billionaire who comes in and says, I know how to do this, I'm going to do it my way. What he said was, he turned to people who he knew, who said, look, my goal is to get these kids past high school into college and to have the kind of opportunities that I had because I was lucky, even though I grew up in disadvantaged circumstances. I had some things these kids didn't have. What are the things that need to happen? And he got some great advice from people who did know what needed to happen. And one of the first pieces he got was, you need a fantastic early childhood program. And so he invested in that. And one of the other pieces of advice he got is, you need wraparound services, because even if you promise every one of these kids a scholarship, which is what this is anchored in, so it's a promise, kind of integrated, geared student supports, without all the services and supports along the way, your kids are going to drop off along the way. And gradually that has built up, and that anchor of the promise and the early childhood at the ends brought the entire community together. So the church came into this, and the school came into this, and social workers came in, and they have basically 100% graduation rate now. And every kid in Tangelo Park who wants to go to college goes to college for free.
That's a great story.
And their graduation rate is remarkable.
That's a great story. Yeah, I mean, like I knew nothing about that. Yeah, that's a great story. So in that case, you had somebody with a vision, just like you had CJ and Joplin, but then that has to meet some ground level receptivity and energy to come together. So, that may not be easily done in some communities where the need is just as great as it is in other places. And I could imagine there are people listening tonight who may have an interest in bringing some kind of programming like this to their communities. But so if you were going to speak to them and say, how do you accomplish something of this magnitude with any degree of hope? How do you enter into it with any degree of hope that you're going to accomplish it? What do you point to as some of the key ingredients? And then we'll get a little bit more into the policy side of it too.
So I would start with a caveat, and the caveat is, and again, we say this loud and clear in the book, we think that in the school reform world in particular, there has been just way too much waving in the past 10, 20 years, 30 years of, mission accomplished banners. And that is not how school improvement works. School improvement has to be a slow, steady, iterative, comprehensive, and thoughtful process that involves steps forward and steps back.
We never do that kind of thing. What are you talking about? It's crazy.
Yes, that is the only way it ever works. So anyone who says otherwise is making stuff up, and you should not believe them. I actually think that is universally, that is just the case. And I hope that is a hopeful thought, because what it means is both at even the most successful communities, and all of them, one of the things they also all recognize is they all still have a lot of work to do. They all see themselves as works in progress, which to me is a sign of a good community. Any community that said they had done all this and they were done, we would not have studied, because again, we don't believe that that happens. But it should also signal to people that this is always a step-by-step process. So one of the things I think is important is, even when you think about a very big community or a small one, this often starts in one school. You know, so a lot of it is, where do you have both a lot of need in that school, but a principal or some other leader, or even a cluster of teachers in the school who are very eager to try to take this on and understand what the needs are. It could be a really powerful, engaged PTA in a school that is your anchor for doing this. There are a lot of ways to kind of hook onto this. It could also be that you've got community partners, in the case of Bright Futures, who are really eager to partner with the school. So you have a church and a local business and an agency who say, you know what, we want to kind of adopt this school. There are a lot of ways that that can get started. I think the importance is starting small, modestly, and taking, you know, little baby steps. And I think the other piece of it is thinking this isn't all one big kind of one big whole, we're going to put all these comprehensive supports in place, but doing one piece at a time. And we could talk about, you know, biting off those pieces as well in more detail.
Yeah, no, well, let's do that a little bit. So, you know, poverty is comprised of many different factors, ranging from, or I don't know if they're factors, but it manifests itself in a lot of different ways in terms of, you know, poor nutrition or poor health. And so, when you think about some of the component pieces that need to be addressed, what did you learn from looking at those communities about attacking, you know, nutrition, healthcare, mental health, any of the pieces that, you know, you and I both know are critical parts of the poverty experience?
So what I learned is that, and again, this really was part of our criteria for studying these communities and featuring them, is that they all began by assessing their needs, right? So they all have hunger needs. They all have medical health needs. They all have mental health needs. Many of them, if not all of them, have some housing needs. But a lot of these conversations are about figuring out what are the most pressing needs.
This is crazy.
In Austin, for example, there was a very interesting conversation when community organizers first came into the schools in Austin about 20 years ago. One of the first things that they did is ask parents in this one school, what are the most pressing needs for your kids? And the parents said, honestly, our kids are not having their basic physical and mental health needs met. And without that, they can't really, they don't go to school. And when they do go to school, they're not learning. And so the community organizer said, you know what, we need to get a win. We need to get a notch for these parents. They need to feel empowered to do this. We're going to push for a health clinic. It sounds like a weird thing to say when you're thinking about trying to fix what's going on in a school, but they said, this is what we heard from parents. This is what parents and some teachers at the school told us was their top priority. This is what we are going to work with them to advocate for. And when they notched that win, it opened up the whole community to having conversations with these organizers, to having trainings to empower parents, to having parents start talking to teachers about what they respectively saw as their needs and their roles. And it kind of snowballed from there into a district-wide community schools effort.
Yeah, that's a great example.
So it works very differently in different schools.
Right.
The other piece I would say that schools do when they look at these needs assessment is they then do an asset assessment of their community. One of the other things that's very important and we felt was critical when we looked at these was there is a deficit kind of viewpoint assigned to both kids growing up in poverty and communities with a lot of poverty. And there is no recognition of the tremendous assets those kids and families and communities bring to the table. And part of what all these communities have done that is so powerful is to recognize that irrespective of the community, there are assets to be leveraged. And so part of what these communities have done is said, where are our assets and how can we bring them together better? And a lot of what they're doing is not so much creating new assets as pulling the assets together, aligning them better, making them more effective because they build on each other, because they're connected to one another. So we have a Boys and Girls Club, but our kids can't get there because so none of them have after school programs. Well, fine, let's just open the school up after school, bring the Boys and Girls Club in. That solves everybody's problems. Kids don't need to be transported, parents don't need to take a bus from work to take their kids somewhere, and the Boys and Girls Club has the kids that they want. Ding. So a lot of it is about lining up assets. And then the other piece of that is mapping your assets and saying, and where do we have holes, and what should be our priorities in filling those in? That's really, in a variety of kind of distinct, specific ways, what all of these communities have been doing.
I think that's a good description of it. That sounds right. So I want to get a little bit into the policy realm. Time goes really quickly, I'm noticing. So in the book, there's a point where you talk about the cradle to career pipeline and how that relates to the integrated support services. And there's a quote in there about how there's a complex web of policy and funding mechanisms that are necessary to accomplish that. And I just wondered, I mean, I think that cradle to career pipeline piece is really important. And we're seeing a lot more people in the education sphere paying attention to that. There's sort of a revival of career and technical education, but, you know, talk a little bit, if you would, about what kind of complex web we're talking about. What are some of the things that need to be in place in order for that pipeline to be created? I know the pipeline model was just one model, but
Yeah.
you know, I was taken by that.
Yeah. So I think there are several pieces to this. One is that we need, so as we talk about, this really is, and education in the US is unique in the sense that it is heavily state and local funded and heavily state and locally controlled. And we are not advocating for changing that. Interestingly enough, I think there are definitely challenges. I don't think there's any reason to think that that is going to change. What we are saying is that each of those kind of layers of government needs to step up to the plate to do its role better, right? And so, and at the same time, part of what we also argue for is that they also need to respect each other's roles. So part of what we talk about briefly in the book, but I focused on a lot at BBA, was that there can be problems with federal and state overreach, and that has to do with policy too. So this is about recognizing that local communities are really best equipped to understand their own needs and assets, and that is where that control should lie. And the closer you can get to the classroom, the more you can listen to teachers and principals and others who know what goes on in those classrooms, the better off that level of policy and practice is going to be. There's an enormous role for states to play that they, by and large, are completely failing on, and that is that they need to be compensating for massive inequities in how schools are funded. I would say that is really the #1 priority. The Education Law Center does a phenomenal job of documenting every year how badly almost every state is failing at this, both in terms of how adequately they fund their schools, and how inadequately, I should say, and how inequitably they fund their schools. So states need to step up. We need a bunch of New Jerseys. Every state needs to be funding schools at high levels, and every state needs to be disproportionately channeling those funds to where they are needed most, not where the voices are the loudest, which is where they go now, and where kids, frankly, don't need them as much because they have everything, or they have a lot more. At both those levels, we need to create incentives for schools and communities to partner with one another, and we should, if possible, attach funding to that. We should make it easier, not harder, and we should be removing barriers and creating incentives at the same time. Nevada has done some of that. Localities have done some of that. There's a great community school playbook that has tons of examples of various ways that states can do this. There's certainly a bigger federal role for increasing the equity in funding, and there's also other roles that the federal government could be playing. It could be a research and practice clearinghouse for best practices. It could be vetting evidence. It could be gathering examples. There's a ton that the federal government could do there. And then there are the more nitty-gritty things, like for all these schools that want to open health clinics, make it easier for them to access public funding so that those health clinics are paid for. So there's really a huge range of policies that could be put in place.
Right. I mean, another problem with those health clinics is that in some states, just the regulatory barriers for doing it.
Yep.
Because it crosses out of the education realm. Now you have to deal with Department of Health and Human Services or something like that. And nobody's used to dealing with those kind of cross-disciplinary approaches.
And that actually, that brings me to another great example and another way that policy could be improved. So one of the communities I didn't get to talk about was Boston, which should win City Connects, which should win a model on a number of levels. Incredibly intensive, for one, really, really, really focused on each child and helping every teacher understand every child, which is fantastic, and providing supports to enable that to happen and putting in place a system, but also being very heavily focused on enrichment. So not just about compensating for what kids don't have, but understanding the assets that kids bring to classrooms, especially poor kids and kids of color, and putting in place systems to build on those assets. So City Connects should get really like a medal for that one. But another thing they should get a medal for is really working with the state of Massachusetts to start to break down those silos across the agencies that touch children in various ways and start creating a more coherent system at the state level for supporting children. Because really, when we think about education, we're crossing here into food and into medicine and into mental and emotional health and wellness and all of that. Those agencies need to be talking to each other. And that is something that City Connects has helped to spur in Massachusetts. And that's another model that I would really urge folks to take a look at.
That's a great point. Let me just check. So I want to, so Elaine, why don't we pause there? Amanda, I don't know if you can see if there are any questions in the chat room. If there are, maybe you can articulate them.
Yeah, we do have one question here and waiting, and I'll invite anyone else who has a question to drop that in the chat box for us. So you can be typing now. The first question we have says, community involvement is important, but we also need to focus on teacher programs that focus on teaching children in poverty, students with disabilities, and English language learners. Do you think this will help future teachers?
Do I think that those programs would help future teachers?
So I believe so, and maybe if our friend who asked the question could pipe in as well, if there are any clarifications needed, we can invite that as well.
So, I mean, my first thought is an emphatic yes, of course, absolutely. And one of the realities that comes with the very different demographics and of the student body today is that teachers do need, frankly, different training. And a lot more of it. I think that is absolutely true. And actually, Bruce and I have talked about, what are the kinds of things that teachers don't learn in education preparation that are important. But I guess what I would also say is that what these communities are doing is complementary to what this participant is asking and noting. And that is that a big part of, so as things stand right now, for an average teacher, a typical teacher in a school like this, the reality is that teacher is not just a teacher. That teacher is the teacher and the counselor and the social worker, also the nurse, the nutritionist, the behavioral specialist, the student resource officer, sometimes the police officer, and who knows what else. And frankly, in some cases, the parent. And so that is not possible. It is not possible to do all those things. It's certainly not possible to do them well, and it isn't possible to do all of them without having a nervous breakdown. I mean, for those of us who are just technically parents, we know that's the case, right? So part of what some of these things that we're talking about are things that teachers actually do understand well how to do, but literally don't have the capacity to do. So a lot of what these schools are doing well, these districts are doing, is freeing up teachers to do those things. Whether it is acting on extremely good gut instincts, which is what a lot of teachers have, because that's what makes a lot of good teachers, or acting on the training that they do have, or freeing up their time to do professional development so they could learn these things, because if they're taking on 10 roles, God knows professional development ain't on the cards for them. So I would say yes to all of those. There's actually a very interesting study done years and years ago by the Center for American Progress on one of the benefits of community schools, which is one of the kind of models or examples focused here that in fact that is one of the benefits, is that teachers are mentally, physically, and logistically freed up to do the things that teachers want to do when these burdens are lifted off of them. And there's some really great quotes from teachers in Joplin expressing that reality, that once the community came in and recognized the burden and said, wait, let us kind of carry some of that, all of a sudden they felt capable of doing what before had felt literally like impossible.
No, and that jibes with research that we've done too. Anything else up there, Amanda? I mean, we can always go on forever, really, but
nothing that I see yet. Oh, we do have a comment that says it appears that teachers do not have the support that is needed and often lack in training, which I think is exactly what you were getting at, Elaine. Teachers are asked to be so many things, and it's important that we focus on training and preparing them adequately, or providing the supports to assist there. No other questions, so I'll let you all.
I'm actually going to go ahead and take a probably like bold step of flagging another piece of research I'm doing that Bruce mentioned, which is this series on teacher shortages that my colleague Emma Garcia and I have been producing for the past year. And indeed, the things we're talking about here are all reflected there. So one of the crises we didn't even talk about in this book, but that has really, I mean, come to the fore hugely in the past year or two, is that we have a national crisis of a shortage of teachers. And a lot of what we're talking about in this book speaks directly to it from the data that Emma and I are looking at. Not only do teachers feel underpaid because they're underpaid, and not only do they feel disrespected because they're disrespected, but they feel incredibly overburdened. Their kids are very poor. Their kids are sick. Their kids are missing too much class. Parents are struggling to engage with the school. Kids are unprepared because they don't have the resources they need. All of these things, when you tack those on to disrespect, low pay, and terrible physical conditions in school, it's hardly a shock that teachers are leaving and that many new people don't want to become teachers. So in fact, part of what our book is also is a cry for help in solving our teacher shortage, which is becoming a really a catastrophe.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be good to see if more Title II funding could be used directly by states to address developing the capabilities of people who are working in the community school models and otherwise.
Right. Part of what we briefly touch on in the book is there are a lot more opportunities within existing federal policy to invest in these strategies. And part of it is about schools being creative. Part of it is, frankly, also about schools having the resources when they're so overburdened as it is to even know that these opportunities exist. They need to have savvy people in central office who can navigate that, and they have to be willing probably to take a little bit of a risk, because it's, even if technically they're allowed to, sometimes they don't feel that necessarily that's going to be accepted. And so part of it is we need to encourage schools, and this goes back to the incentivizing, to in fact take up these opportunities where they exist and to advocate for them where they don't.
Yep. I think I saw a question come up there from one of our PhD students who I've actually taught in Montgomery County.
Oh.
Is Kim did I see a question from Kim Stone?
There is a question from Kim. Before that, I think Chris asked, can I speak on this? So one of our guests may have some additional commentary or conversation to share. Chris, if you're able to unmute, go ahead.
Thanks, Amanda. And thank you, Professor Levine and Dr. Weiss. One thing I would like to see a policy change, I think, would help with teachers to remain in the classroom, especially our newer teachers. If we can look at our highly qualified teachers in the school or in the district, that we could have them to relieve them of their classroom duties and just work inside the classroom with the newer teachers for 1 year, and to monitor to that and see would that be a way in which we can retain newer teachers and we can teach them best practices within inside the classroom instead of waiting until after the classroom or when they become very frustrated. So what do you think that would look like in a policy decision-making scheme?
So you are completely right, and I'm going to make, absolutely, I think that is critical, and I'm going to make two comments that are relevant both to Emma's and my work and this work. we actually are planning to work on a paper specifically on new teachers and the challenges facing new teachers. And one of the big challenges is, particularly in high poverty schools, which is a subset of schools that we look at, there is a lack of highly qualified and experienced teachers because those teachers leave those schools, and there's so much turnover in those schools because of the challenges we're talking about. The pressures in those schools are so intense. And tacked onto that, as Paul and I discussed, you know, the prior wave of school reform was all about testing. And testing did this really double whammy of, you know, of damage to teachers. One was it made teaching really not fun because there was just so much time devoted to testing. But the other piece was it put teachers in high poverty schools at tremendous disadvantage. It made them look very bad because it was really hard to get great test scores in those schools for all the reasons we're talking about. One of the great things we're seeing in these schools, and in fact, some of the communities are already starting to measure this, is they are better able to retain their teachers. Because those teachers who would have been on the fence when they're 3, 4, 5 years, you know, into teaching and could have either jumped ship, which is what a lot of teachers are doing, or moved to an easier school, are saying, you know what, I have what I need. This is rewarding. I can do what I wanted to do, which is help kids who need a good teacher the most without being killed and smothered by all these responsibilities. And so this model actually enables schools to do the smart thing exactly that you're describing, which is free up, retain teachers, veteran teachers, so they're there to serve as mentors, but free them up because they don't have 10 million responsibilities.
Yeah. Makes sense. Okay.
All right, so we do have a question from Kim. She asks, how can we encourage more states to implement equitable funding policies, especially where the loudest voices do not support shifting funding to serve those students with the highest needs?
It is a really tough question. We can see it at the community level. You're in Montgomery County, I'm in Montgomery County. We all know that we are having some tough conversations right now about this equitable funding pattern that we have in place. So it just demonstrates, even in one community and a very progressive one, this is very challenging. One of the things, again, that we do not shy away from in this book is saying this is not easy and not and challenging. And that is also what really good school improvement or any policy improvement should be. Again, if someone tells you it's easy, they're lying. That said, what we are seeing, I think one great example of why states should do this and a motivator is looking at New York and New Jersey. So New York and New Jersey over the past 20 years are an excellent study in what happens when you spend a lot of money, pretty much an equal amount of money in two neighboring states, one of them very equitably and very wisely. So you invest more in teachers, you invest a lot in early childhood education, you invest in the smart stuff versus New York, where it's very inequitably spent and very badly spent. And what you see is New Jersey has really shot up when it comes to both NAEP scores and closing achievement gaps. And that is just good for the state. I mean, what state does not want a better educated, population in which more kids graduate, fewer kids drop out, fewer kids go to jail, and more kids become productive citizens? I really think New York and New Jersey are sort of like an easy test case for that. For quite a while, Tennessee and Kentucky were kind of following that same pattern. Kentucky being the smart, equitable investor, and Tennessee doing a lot of stuff badly. Unfortunately, Kentucky sort of fell off that bandwagon for a while and is now trying to recover. But the reality is that these investments pay off for states in spades. And perhaps just as important, when we don't make them, they cost states unbelievable amounts. Every one of these states that is not doing this, the less they do it, the more they are paying through the nose for things that nobody wants to pay for prisons, for welfare services, for addiction treatment, for burying people who committed suicide.
Right.
Okay, nobody wants to be paying for that stuff. That is nobody's idea of an investment. So I think really the number one argument is you can either invest well and reap the benefits, or you can spend badly the way you don't want.
Right, although this gets into one of the perennial problems with policy, not just in education in this country, is the long-term versus short-term perspective, right? Especially when there are politicians involved who aren't that concerned about what things look like 12 years from now. They want to know that in 3 years, when they're running for election,
Yeah.
something has been accomplished. So
yeah. Well, the other thing I would say is if especially you states that, got yourself some new governors that care about this and turned your legislatures in 2018, advocate, vote, get out there, pay attention, and make sure that the people who you elected on this platform have your back and know they have your back, and pay attention to the legislatures and governors that are not doing this well. And again, get out there and vote and tell them how you feel.
good advice.
I mean, we happen to have an election coming up that's kind of important. You could probably do that.
Probably true. I don't know, Kim. Okay, Kim, you're good with that? Okay.
We do have one more question if we have time for that.
Yeah,
Right
why don't
now?
we sneak in one more and then...
Great. So one of our guests tonight has asked, do you think that teachers could focus more on student academics if they do not have multiple responsibilities? And is there any way that we could encourage a better communication among teachers and parents?
Yeah.
The first one is a very definite, obvious yes. Teachers would just be better able to focus generally if they didn't have to do other things. I mean, I know that when my kids are not demanding that I make them a snack, serve as their social worker, shuttle them and do other things, my focus tends to be much better. I can only assume that that is true exponentially more so for teachers. In terms of parent-teacher communication, one of the things I'm sorry we didn't get to have a conversation about was how powerful that is in these communities. Because these communities begin with conversations. And this is actually a really, really critical criterion that I did not get to talk about, we sought out communities where teachers and parents and community voices were a critical central part of the conversation from the beginning in shaping how the community and the school would address the issues. These are all about parent-teacher conversations. And part of what this does is parent engagement is a very central factor in every one of these. I wish I had gotten to talk about Berea, Kentucky, which is one of the most devastated regions in this entire country. It has been slammed by just one thing after another, loss of coal jobs, loss of railroads, and now it's opioid central. And remarkable things are happening in Berea, and in no small part because a huge part of their focus is on not just engaging parents, but empowering parents. And so we're seeing parents who did not even believe in themselves as parents, who failed in school, who never made it through past 8th or 9th grade, being kind of risen up, being elevated, and being engaged in the schools through intentional practices, and some of them going on to run for school board, becoming great advocates for their kids, becoming their school's best advocates. It's incredibly powerful. So that is huge, and thank you so much for the question. It's something really central that we didn't touch on, and I'm sorry.
Right. And so
so there's a ton in the book, as you can see.
there is a ton in the book, and again, I will pitch the book, not you. This is really a good book. If you're at all interested in this topic, I've already shared it with some colleagues, actually internationally, who didn't know very much about the U.S., and they thought the book was fabulous. So highly recommend it. And just as a teaser, I mean, Elaine and I are hatching plans for doing other things to continue this kind of conversation. So look for it on your favorite streaming device or something. But anyway, for the moment, thank you, Elaine, very much for coming.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn it over to Amanda, who has some important things to say.
I do. So thank you again, Elaine and Bruce, for your insights this evening and your time. And thank you to those of you who have stuck around with us to the end of our session. Hopefully you're inspired and motivated to get more involved in the education policy and advocacy space. And perhaps that's by furthering your education in education policy. So right now I'm going to take a few minutes just to talk about the Ed Policy program at Drexel and the options that are available to you. So if I can share my screen here. Hopefully that can be seen.
We can see it.
Perfect. So if you're not already familiar with Drexel University, we may have some external guests tonight. We are a brick and mortar institution in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, with a heavy emphasis on research and experiential learning university-wide. So most people, when they think of Drexel, they think of us as the co-op school. Most of our undergraduate population is completing at least one co-op experience during their time in their undergraduate programs. But what you may or may not know is that Drexel is extensively involved in online education. So the School of Education in particular offers, I would say, a majority of our programming in an online format. So what that means for us is that educators from around the world, truly, can come to our programs and engage in our online environments. And this leads to a really great diversity in the classroom settings. So at the School of Ed at Drexel, we do offer a graduate level certificate in education policy. And this certificate is designed to prepare individuals to understand the numerous complex issues that are facing educational systems today, and to be able to apply that knowledge and understanding into their careers. So you'll see here on the screen just a few of the issues that we are facing and we're addressing. So the integration of technology in K through 20 education, equity and access very broadly, urban education improvement, government and private sector influence in public education, and then higher education institutions as they relate to workforce development. So these topics and many others, it's not an exhaustive list, are addressed through the education policy curriculum at Drexel. And as I mentioned before, it is a fully online part-time program. So you can access your coursework from wherever you are, anywhere in the world. And you can complete your studies part-time while maintaining your employment. So you don't need to leave your job to be able to enroll in the education policy certificate program, which is a huge benefit because you can then take the concepts that you're studying in class and apply them back into your workplace. Or you can take the challenges and the problems of practice that you're seeing in your daily life and bring them into the classroom. So that's just one example of this connection between theory and practice that we really value at Drexel. So the Ed Policy program does consist of 18 credits or 6 courses that are required, and it can be completed in as little as 4 terms. If you're not familiar, Drexel is operating on the quarter system, so we do 4 10-week terms per year. So if you go 4 terms in a row, you can complete the program in 12 months. And we admit for both the spring and the fall quarters, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But some students may be interested in the education policy field, but are seeking something other than a certificate. So fortunately, we do offer education policy as a concentration in several other programs at the School of Ed, including the EDD in Educational Leadership and Management, as well as the master's programs in Education Improvement and Transformation, in Global and International Education, and in Higher Education. So these concentrations allow you to take somewhere between 3 and 5 courses in the education policy program as part of your master's or doctoral program. So that helps to complement and enhance your curriculum that you're completing in those programs. So who is completing an education policy program at Drexel? We see a variety of students in our coursework. Some are current educators who are broadly interested in the policy side and its relation within the US or international education systems. Some are early career or career changers and want to pursue jobs specifically in the education policy realm. And finally, we have some who are already working in an education policy related job, but want to learn more and to maximize their effectiveness in their roles. So throughout the courses that I'll share with you in just a moment, students are learning and exploring some of these following topics that are listed here. So looking at economic relationships in US education, examining how policymaking occurs at different levels from the state all the way down to the district level. Looking at the diverse and ever-changing models of K-12 education. And urban education is a really big topic right now. There are a number of faculty and many students at Drexel specifically who are interested in this topic. And finally, looking at post-secondary and lifelong learning opportunities. So as I shared before, the certificate consists of 6 classes. I'm not sure if you can read these here, but I will read them out in case anyone can't see them here. Those 6 classes are Education Policy, Concepts, Issues, and Applications, the Shaping of American Education Policy, Global Forces, Public Interests, and Politics, American Education Policy and United States Competitiveness, Ethics in Educational Policymaking, Access and Equality in Educational Policymaking, and Educational Policymaking, Tactics, and Influence. So you'll see that these courses cover broad ranges and theories that are applicable in the ed policy realm, but then you're given the opportunity to connect those to your individualized areas of interest or the regions that you're working in. So as I indicated, the program can be completed in somewhere between 12 and 18 months, depending on if you are taking 1 or 2 courses at a time. We're offering spring and fall start terms, and the certificate is federal financial aid eligible. So that's a common question that we receive from students. If you are seeking that federal aid that is available during this program, some other students may pursue employer benefits or tuition of some kind. And if you do have any questions about the information that I've shared or the content, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My email address is right here on the screen, and I'll continue to share that with you. So if you are ready to take that next step and further your education at Drexel, please know that we are currently accepting applications for the spring quarter. The deadline is quickly approaching. So the spring deadline is March 2nd, and that's for classes that are beginning on March 29th. If you have not submitted your application or you're not ready to begin this spring and you're thinking about the fall term, that application is also open and available. The deadline to submit your materials for that program will be August 24th, and that's for the fall quarter, which begins September 21st. You can start your application by following that link right there on the screen. And in addition to the online application form, there are a number of documents you'll need to submit. You will need to send all official transcripts from postgraduate institutions that you've attended. So that would, or post-secondary institutions. So that would be any of your undergraduate and graduate transcripts. You'll also need 2 letters of recommendation, and they should be either academic or professional letters of recommendation. Please don't send any personal letters from, mom, dad, your neighbor. And then in addition to those materials, we do ask that you submit a personal statement. So that can be, it should be talking about your interest in the program, your interest in education policy, and your goals as they're related to the program completion, and your career. We do not require any GRE scores or application fee for this program, so that's important to keep in mind as well. I know this is a lot of information, and we're trying to be mindful of your time this evening. Thanks for sticking it out with us here to the end. And if there are any questions about materials that I have shared here, please feel free, I'll stick around. Please feel free to either unmute your microphone and ask, or utilize the chat box, and I'm happy to answer any questions that we have available. And if there are no questions this evening, I'll leave my contact information and Bruce Levine's contact information in case you want to reach out to us at a later time. All right, not seeing any questions immediately. I will stick around just in case anyone wants to hang back and ask any questions. But other than that, I think, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thanks for taking your time here on a Wednesday night. We appreciate it. And thank you again, Elaine Weiss, for joining us, and Bruce Levine for hosting. Any final parting thoughts from anyone?
I think we're good.
Excellent. Well, thank you all again. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and our contact information is here if you need to find us later. Have a good night.